They're not scared of you. They're scared of what you represent to them. What you represent to them is freedom.
If you have the inconsistency, then you're really not defending liberty.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
I'm going to bring the whole fucking diseased, corrupt temple down on your head.
Hostility against every form of tyranny over the minds of man.
This is the Whiskey and Rebellion podcast.
If you stop to look around today at the size and scope of the American government in your day-to-day life, you'll realize that they really have their grubby little hands in everything. There isn't much left in life that you can do that doesn't require a tax, a license, a permit, or isn't otherwise controlled or restricted by some sort of government regulation. There's always an alphabet agency or some rarely read, if even known, code to dictate what you can and cannot do with your body or your property. Oh, you want to start a barbershop? Get a fucking license. You can't be free to cut a person's hair without the state saying so. You want to lay back after a long day at work and smoke a joint? Boom, DEA, your dog's dead. You want to buy a joint in a state that you live in where it's legalized? Boom, 15 to 35% sales tax. You just started your dream job with a higher pay so you can pay off your debts and save for a house? Boom, the government mafia gets its cut. You just finished off paying your house? Boom, property tax. You never truly own it, you rent from the state. Everything is theirs, you just have the privilege of paying for it. But you see, these taxes and licenses are the price that you pay to live in a civilized society. Without them, there would be anarchy. And it's a fat price and a lot of work to ensure that we don't lose our civility and our order. You've got your federal income tax, your state income tax, payroll tax, capital gains tax, sales tax, your property tax, and real estate tax. Your estate tax, gift tax, hotel tax, sin tax, luxury tax, airline tax, rental car tax, cell phone tax, toll road tax, gas tax, utility tax, etc., etc., etc. And the taxes have only gotten worse and more extreme and ridiculous over the years. And why is that? Like, when will it end? It's because we have to pay for the absolute behemoth of a government that the United States has become, and it only ends when you decide how far is too far. They have to find new ways of siphoning off money from the people in order to pay for Americans' unlimited wants and needs. Let's look at the historical change, because the government expenditures have skyrocketed since the founding of this country. At the end of the 19th century, a mere 3% of gross domestic product in the United States made up the entirety of government spending. Even in the year 1900 compared to 1873, the United States government would have seemed almost unrecognizable to the founders. But what about today? In 2018, the total government spending at federal, state, and local levels reached 36%. That's 12 times the debt to GDP of 1900. Some of you might be asking why this matters. What does government spending have to do with what went wrong? Government spending doesn't necessarily mean tyranny. And the simple answer is this, that government actions can do one of two things. They can protect your individual rights or infringe on those rights. That money the government spends today, which this fiscal year is $4.4 trillion, and that's trillion with a T, is being used to finance every government agency and program that both claims to protect your rights or infringe on them. These alphabet agencies, laws, permits, and licenses that dictate nearly everything that you're able to do today are funded by this ever-growing collection of money forcibly taken from Americans to fund an ever-expanding reach of federal, state, and local governments. Yes, there is some spending that deals with the protection of your individual liberties, but in relation to the parts of government that are seeking new ways to breach into your day-to-day life, that spending is shrinking. Your natural rights are finite, while the new opportunities of control the government is sniffing out are not. There is no limit to what the government would willingly accept as its responsibility in your affairs. And even more so in instances of programs that were established to protect your rights, like police and the courts. More of their time and money is being spent ensuring the prosecution of victimless crimes to help attain federal funding at their departments and detract from your liberty. It doesn't pay as well solely focusing on providing protection for your liberty. British rule over the Americas at the time of the Revolution allowed exceptionally more freedom than current American rule. Smaller taxes and more seldom dealings between the American colonists and the Crown would appear to today's Americans as a virtually non-existent government. The Americans of 1776 went to war over things today's Americans would not likely even shrug at. In 1764, Parliament passed a tax on sugar requiring colonists to pay 3 to 6 pence per gallon on imported molasses. And according to R.R. Palmer in his book The Age of Democratic Revolution, the taxes levied by the British on Americans to help pay for the cost of the French and Indian War just 20 years before the signing of the Declaration were only 6% of what those in Britain paid. 6%. An Englishman would be paying more than 16 times what the Americans were, and they still went to war. This wasn't the only reason at the time for going to war, but little things like this were all it took to drive the colonists to declare independence. The British wanted to price out the molasses being imported from the French West Indies and make the English equivalent the cheaper option. The tax also included sugar, wines, and coffee, and regulated the export of lumber and iron, which hurt merchants across the colonies, but particularly in New England and Virginia. What was the reaction from the colonists? Smuggling, which was met with an increased presence of the British Navy in the colonies. And what was their reaction to the extra ships moving up and down the eastern seaboard? You probably guessed it, more smuggling and a war. But let's look at today. What are some sugar-type taxes that we see? 2 years ago, the city of New York outlawed large soft drinks. God forbid that an American citizen buy a 44-ounce fountain drink in the land of the free. The city of Seattle last year passed a tax on sugar in sweetened beverages that went viral across social media in the form of a picture of a large pack of Gatorade at Costco, increasing in price from $15.99 to $26.33. That's almost doubling. In both of these cases, there was some outrage. You saw a few Fox News analysts complain, some social media posts condemn, but nothing that angry. Nothing like the colonists. The general public reaction was much more of a soft and polite questioning of why. It was like Americans looking helplessly up at their political masters with a sad look on their face like a beaten dog. Frankly, it was pathetic. The difference between the colonists and the founders and modern-day Americans is that the Americans of 1776 weren't scared to bite the hand that fed them, whereas the Americans of today will make do with what scraps of their earnings and what few freedoms the state allows them to keep after it fills its ever-growing appetite for new government programs, responsibilities, and control. The system that feeds on Americans' tax money for its own benefit has become, in the eyes of most Americans, the justification for it doing so. If you don't like the law, the tax, the system, etc., you gotta use your vote to change it. What the government is doing is legal. It was voted on. That's all the reasoning most people need. That's all there is to it to most Americans, and that's where the discussion ends. And the rallying cry of no taxation without representation espoused by the colonists? Well, there is some degree of representation now, so why are you complaining? Why am I complaining? The state is legally allowed to tax, but that's the problem in getting caught up helplessly in the legality. The colonists weren't concerned with what was legal, they were concerned with what was moral. Just because you have some representation, what does that mean? Does it mean that representatives can do what they please and that it's your responsibility to constantly react to encroachments? The state is legally allowed to tax, but can they tax anything at any cost at any time? Legality and morality have become synonymous to most Americans, but they're not always, and I would say that in the current legal system of today, they are rarely the same. Is it legal for the state to tax the income of workers in the United States and discriminate based on annual earnings? It sure is. Is it right that the state can help itself to a large portion of your income and demand that your employer take money out of your paycheck every pay period? Is it right that they can force you to pay for things that you don't use or that you don't support? Is it right that the average American household only takes 76% or loses 24% of what it makes? Not including then what it pays in non-income taxes like consumption taxes, sin taxes, etc. There is legal and then there is right. The revolution of the colonists, for example, was definitely not legal, but it sure as hell was right. America was supposed to be constructed in a way that the government's laws were subjected to what was natural and moral. Its law was never supposed to supersede natural law. There were absolutes that were not to be touched by legislation. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of practicing your religion, the bearing of arms, and everything else outlined in the Bill of Rights. The absolutes have been chipped away enough that the state, over time, can and will do as much as it can get away with. If I were to ask you your definition of tyranny, you would probably describe some 1984 version of the state where it's so powerful that it can control what people think, say, do for work, how they spend their day, etc., and will not hesitate to re-educate, imprison, or kill those that oppose it. And yeah, America isn't at that point yet, and I'm not going to claim it is, but it's getting close. If you look at where we came from and where we are now, you can see that we're moving on a trajectory towards something similar. So where did we go wrong? What the fuck happened? How did Americans go from questioning authority, admiring disobedience towards tyrants, and being willing to die for their inalienable rights, to being nothing more than tax cattle misled into thinking that they're free? This was a slow degradation. It wasn't sudden. The tyrannical laws of today didn't just start yesterday, and we have to go back in time. Was it after 9/11 when we allowed ourselves to begin living in an era of mass surveillance and constant war, pleading for security at whatever cost of freedom it required? No, it was even before that. Was it the Reagan presidency with its ramping up of militarism in the police force and American foreign policy? No. Vietnam? No, it was before that. World War II, World War I, Spanish-American War, all before that. The Civil War, before that. Trouble between the states, the earliest days of American independence, the Whiskey Rebellion, like we talked about the first podcast. We have to go back even further. I think that it was the Constitution itself. The system that the founders created, quite honest, was somewhat hypocritical when coupled with the ideas of freedom. I'm not denouncing the Constitution completely at all, and I don't want to seem like I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The Constitution is arguably humanity's greatest political achievement to date, especially as someone who holds individual liberty and personal freedom paramount to the majority tyranny and state control. The problem is that the founders, who recognized the importance of the individual's life, liberty, and property, and saw a historical trend of governments devolving towards tyranny, didn't do enough to prevent the same thing from happening again. This is obviously 2020 hindsight, but they did not ensure that the shackles placed on government's ability to grow were kept as tight as possible. They believed that the government had an obligation and a moral duty to protect the God-given right of all Americans, but also made it possible for the state to take part in programs, laws, etc., that had nothing to do with rights enforcement, but actually made possible the violation of those rights. They allowed a pathway for the government to fill a role that it had no authority to fill, that being a nanny state. They were idealistic to believe that Americans as free people would not become domesticated, that politics would not attempt to fulfill the desires of society, and that society would not demand more of politics in return. They were naive enough to believe that you could have a legislature create laws under very vague parameters, judged by courts under the same government that could be made up of members with very differing opinions over what the exact same words mean, and enforced by an executive whose candidacy would evolve into a race for an office with enough control to change the direction of American history. Checks and balances really, if you think about it, legitimize the state growth. If the Supreme Court were to rule a new law passed by Congress is constitutional, no matter how tyrannical it is, then it was accepted by most Americans without question and would become the new norm. Taking steps backwards wouldn't be possible. There was not enough of a constriction on government's abilities, and although it was enough to slow the rise of a tyrannical state, nearly 250 years after the Declaration of Independence, we're beginning to see the natural ability of the state to circumvent its so-called checks and balances and grasp onto new powers wherever it can. In essence, I think the founders were onto the right ideas, and they were philosophical and political pioneers, they just didn't have the execution. Your life, liberty, and property are absolutes, outside of the control of others, regardless of titles, badges, uniforms, or whatever state accolades one receives that makes them believe that they can operate outside of the common rules of man. These rights can't be diluted by policy and still retain their meaning. They can't be regulated, taxed, licensed, or banned. If they are, they cease to become inalienable. They're supposed to be outside of the government's scope of control, completely and with no exceptions. They were said to be inalienable, but now everything is on the table for the government to grab, so long as they can do it slowly enough for the rest of us not to notice, or for society just to not care. There are holes we see now that the founders didn't. A house is only as good as the foundation that it's built on, and the United States was built on a good foundation, but not a great one, and definitely not a perfect one. The greatest experiment in human history, for which the United States served as a perfect petri dish, is coming to a close. After 2.5 centuries, we are beginning to see cracks, and Americans are becoming aware of the symptoms, but not the cause. And the cause is government. We all know about the holes, but speaking out against the Constitution is the ultimate disrespect to most modern-day Americans. You're not allowed to criticize the Constitution while also claiming that you love America. Speaking out against the Constitution and being critical of the United States government seems to most people today to be the same as spitting in the face of Lady Liberty. Freedom, liberty, rights, etc. aren't seen to exist by most Americans without say-so from the same government that constantly endangers them. They have become cheap buzzwords no one really thinks about. Does it not make more sense that allowing Lady Liberty to be prostituted and controlled for the personal gain of politicians in Washington is infinitely worse than speaking out against the system that we are continuing to build on a degrading foundation? And what's worse is all of this slow degradation has been coupled with a slow domestication of Americans. Freedom and liberty were traded for security without hesitation. Especially today, think of the children. Millions will die, terrorists will strike, criminals will run rampant. All of these hypotheticals and boogeymen were shoved down the throats of every American during the evening news or over a long enough time that freedom has become a hollow word used without thought by politicians campaigning for office and fake patriots virtue signaling their allegiance today. Freedom does not bring security. Usually it brings hardship. But what it does prevent is control by a state that becomes increasingly more powerful with every taxed paycheck and congressional session. With freedom, you may not be able to ensure that you'll be free from robbery, murder, or assault. What you can ensure, though, is that those things will not become institutionalized through state-promised security. It's a special person who desires freedom over security, who can look at the promises and temptations of the state's picture-perfect tomorrow as a reward for their subservience and reject them wholeheartedly. That analogy I used of Americans as tax cattle got me thinking about the Aurochs. The Aurochs were the ancestors of modern-day cattle. They were big, beastly, ferocious animals that lived in modern-day Europe and on the Asian steppe. They were ferocious too and would not hesitate to attack hunters or packs of wolves. When I was in college reading Julius Caesar's Bellum Gallicum, he remarked about the Aurochs as he traveled through Gaul and Germania. He said the Uri, as he called them, were little below the elephant in size, and of the appearance, color, and shape of a bull. Their strength and speed are extraordinary. They spare neither man nor wild beast which they have espied. These the Germans take with much pains in pits and kill them. The young men harden themselves with this exercise, and practice themselves in this kind of hunting, and those who have slain the greatest number of them, having produced the horns in public to serve as evidence, receive great praise. But not even when taken very young can they be rendered familiar to men and tamed. The Aurochs were just bovines. They're a different breed of cattle, but of little physical difference to today's beef cattle. After thousands of years of domestication, cattle have gotten softer. It's the same thing with Americans. Today, for some reason, if cattle were all freed, beef cattle could possibly survive without their farmers, but the dairy cows would likely all die off without the calories being provided in the milking done by the farmers. Some Americans today are beef cattle, and some are so lost that I don't see a difference between them and dairy cows. They can't survive without a farmer-like state to feed them and milk them. I want Americans and humans to be how they're naturally meant to be, like Aurochs. Even if you're in the metaphorical German tribes' killing pits, I want you to have a free man's mentality, untamable. Not able and not willing to ever be domesticated or controlled. Freedom requires that people first think of themselves as free, and I want you to be free. I want you to have the free man's mindset to the extreme that no matter how large or controlling the government, I want you to think for yourself that the government might control the whole fucking world, but they're not going to control you.